The boy's voice was barely a whisper, and for a moment, Richard Sterling thought he'd simply imagined it. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling window of his corner office on the 45th floor, a bone-white ceramic mug halfway to his lips, gazing at the brown river snaking through the city below. The coffee smelled exactly as it always did on a Thursday morning, dark roast with a faint wisp of steam and a subtle hint of cinnamon that his assistant added because his late father had once taken his coffee that way when Richard was a boy in Chicago. Everything was perfectly normal. And yet, the boy remained frozen in the doorway, one small hand against the frame, watching him with a stillness that felt profoundly out of place on a child. "What did you just say?" Richard asked. He recognized the boy, or at least thought he did. He was the son of one of the janitorial staff, perhaps 9 or 10 years old. Richard had seen him twice in the lobby over the past month. Once on a Saturday when the boy was sitting on a bench reading a worn paperback, and once on a Wednesday when he was waiting by the service elevator with a small backpack slung over his shoulders. Richard had never spoken to him. He'd given a polite nod once, the kind of nod he offered to people whose names he didn't know, and the boy had nodded back. "Please don't drink it, sir," the boy said, a little louder this time. "Just don't." Richard lowered the mug slowly. He was a man who had spent his life mastering the art of not reacting to surprises. As chairman of Sterling Capital, a private investment firm whose name appeared on skyscrapers across 3 cities, he didn't alter his routine because a child appeared unannounced. He didn't change anything because of a feeling. He looked at the boy and kept his voice calm and measured. "Son, how did you get up here?" The boy didn't answer directly. His eyes weren't those of a child playing games. They belonged to someone who had been hiding in a stairwell for nearly an hour, wrestling with whether to speak up. "The man who brought it," the boy said. "I saw him in the hallway outside the kitchen this morning. He had a small bottle in his hand. He poured something into a cup. Then he wiped the bottle with a cloth and put it in his pocket. Then he carried the cup down the hall toward your office." Richard didn't move. He felt his heartbeat in an unfamiliar place, somewhere low in his chest, just beneath his ribs. The mug in his hand suddenly felt unbearably warm. He set it down carefully on the small marble table beside the window. He didn't let go of it entirely. He simply placed it there and kept his fingers wrapped around the porcelain, because he wasn't ready to step away. "Which man?" Richard asked quietly. "What did he look like?" The boy considered the question carefully. He didn't rush. He had a measured thoughtfulness that Richard had only ever seen in people who'd learned early that the wrong word in the wrong place could end things permanently. "He was tall," the boy said. "Dark hair, combed back. Gray suit, not black. He had a silver watch on his right wrist. And he wasn't wearing a name badge, but everyone else in that hallway was. That's what I noticed first. That's why I followed him." Richard closed his eyes for a single heavy second. There were 53 people on this floor at any given moment, and he could have named maybe 7 of them without checking his calendar. He didn't know who'd brought the coffee this morning. He hadn't looked up when the mug was placed on his desk. He'd been on a conference call with Tokyo, and the small white cup with its wisp of steam had simply appeared beside his elbow at 8:12, as it had every Thursday for the past 11 years. He opened his eyes and looked at the boy. "What's your name?" he asked. The boy hesitated, then said, "Elijah." "Elijah," Richard repeated, the way a person repeats a name when they want to lock it away somewhere safe. "Elijah, I need you to do something for me. Step inside and close the door behind you, slowly. Don't run. Don't look back down the hallway. Just close it and come stand by the window with me." The boy did exactly as he was told. He pushed the heavy glass door shut with both hands, careful not to let it slam, then crossed the long stretch of pale carpet until he stood beside the marble table where the coffee sat untouched. Up close, Richard could see that the boy's shirt was faded navy, with a small tear near the hem that someone had tried to repair with mismatched thread. His sneakers were clean but scuffed at the toes. He smelled faintly of lemon soap, the kind dispensed from metal containers in public restrooms, and Richard understood, without needing to ask, that the boy had washed his hands before coming up here because he'd wanted to look presentable when he told a complete stranger that someone was trying to poison him. "Elijah," Richard said quietly, "tell me everything. From the beginning. Don't leave anything out. When did you first see this man?" The boy took a shallow breath. His shoulders trembled once and then steadied, the way a small bird steadies itself on a branch after a long flight. "It was about an hour ago," he said. "Maybe more. My mom works on the cleaning crew on the 36th floor. I came with her this morning because there's no school today and the sitter couldn't come. She told me to sit in the break room and read my book and not bother anyone. I was reading. I was on chapter 5 and then I needed to use the bathroom, so I went out into the hallway. I took the wrong turn coming back and ended up near the catering kitchen, the one by the freight elevator where they bring up the coffee and food trays. That's where I saw him. He was standing by one of the steel carts with the silver lids. He had a cup in his hand, a white cup like that one." Elijah nodded toward the marble table without looking directly at the coffee. He had a small brown bottle in his other hand, about the size of eye drops. He unscrewed the cap and poured something into the cup. He was careful about it. He counted the drops. I saw his lips moving, maybe 4 or 5 drops. Then he screwed the cap back on, took a napkin from the cart, wiped the bottle off, and put it in his jacket pocket, the inside pocket on the left side. Richard didn't move. He listened the way a man listens when he understands that the next 2 minutes will determine the rest of his life. And then he picked up the cup and walked down the hallway toward the corner. There's a sign on the wall that says Executive Offices with an arrow pointing that way. He followed the arrow. I followed him, but I stayed back because I didn't want him to see me. He took the small private elevator at the end, the one that needs a key card. He had a card. He swiped it, the door opened, and he got in. The door closed before I could see what floor he pressed. "What did you do then?" "I went back to the break room. I sat down. I tried to read my book again, but I kept thinking about the bottle. I kept thinking, why would a man put drops in coffee and then wipe the bottle and hide it? People don't do that with sugar. People don't do that with cream. People don't hide their hands when they're doing something that's allowed." Elijah looked up at Richard. His eyes were steady. "My mom always says, if something doesn't look right, it probably isn't right." So I got up. I asked the security guard at the front desk on 36 what floor the executive offices were on. He said 45. He said the chairman's office. He said your name. Then I took the stairs. Richard looked at him for a long moment. "The stairs," he said quietly. "From 36 to 45. By yourself?" "Yes, sir. I didn't want to use the elevator because I thought he might be on it." The boy paused. "I'm sorry it took me so long to get here. I had to stop twice on the landings. I was breathing hard. I didn't want to come in here breathing hard because I didn't want you to think I was lying." Richard Sterling, who hadn't cried in front of another person in nearly 30 years, felt something shift painfully behind his eyes. He didn't let it show. He'd built a career on not letting things show. He simply nodded once, slowly, and looked away toward the window so the boy wouldn't see whatever was in his face. The river outside was moving the way it always did on Thursdays, dark and sluggish under a pale sky, a small tugboat working its way south toward the docks. Richard watched it for 2 breaths. Then he turned back to the boy. "Elijah, listen to me carefully. I'm going to ask you to stay in this office with me for a while. I'm not going to call anyone yet. I'm not going to drink that coffee. I'm not going to leave this room. I want you to sit on that sofa by the bookshelf. Put your feet up if you want. There's a small refrigerator behind the bar. There's orange juice, water, and a couple of chocolate milks that my granddaughter likes. You can have whatever you want." "Yes, sir." "Good. Now I'm going to make one phone call, then another. While I'm doing that, I want you to drink something and rest. You climbed 9 flights of stairs to warn a man you don't know. You don't have to do anything else for a while." Elijah walked to the sofa. He sat on the very edge, the way a child sits when he's not sure he's allowed to be there. He didn't put his feet up. He folded his hands in his lap and waited. Richard looked at him for one more second, then walked around the long desk and picked up the phone. He didn't call security. He didn't call the police. He called a man named Frank Morrison, who'd been the head of his personal security detail for 14 years and who'd once been a senior agent with the Bureau before deciding he'd rather work for one man than for an entire country. "Frank," Richard said when the line connected, "I need you in my office. Now. Use the north stairwell. Don't use the elevator. Don't speak to anyone on the way up. When you get to my door, knock twice, pause, then knock once more. Don't announce yourself by name. Understood?" There was a brief silence on the other end. Frank Morrison had heard Richard Sterling use this tone exactly 4 times in 14 years. He didn't ask a single question. "On my way," he said. 5 minutes. Richard set the phone down. He looked at the mug on the marble table. It was still warm. The steam had thinned but hadn't yet disappeared. He looked at it for a long moment and thought about all the Thursdays over the past 11 years when a similar cup had appeared beside his elbow at 8:12. And he wondered how many of those cups had been exactly what they seemed, and how many, perhaps, had not. He didn't know the answer. He didn't need to know yet. He needed only to know about this one. He sat down in his chair and looked across the desk at Elijah on the sofa, who was now sipping a small bottle of chocolate milk with both hands wrapped around it, the way a much younger child would hold a cup. The boy met his eyes once and gave him a small, serious nod, as if to say, "I'm still here. I'm not going anywhere." "Elijah," Richard said quietly, "while we wait for my friend to arrive, I want to ask you one more thing. The man you saw in the catering hallway, the one with the bottle, did you see his face clearly enough to recognize him again? If I showed you a photograph, could you tell me if it was him?" The boy thought about it carefully. He didn't rush. "Yes, sir," he said. "I think so. I saw his face from the side when he was pouring the drops, and I saw it from the front for about 2 seconds when he turned around. He didn't see me because I was standing behind one of the catering carts. But I saw him. He had a small mark on the side of his jaw near his ear, like a scar but not deep, more like a line. And his eyebrows were dark, but his hair had some gray in it, mostly near the temples. And he was wearing a watch that was thicker than the ones the catering staff wear. It had a black face." Richard nodded slowly. He picked up a pen and wrote 3 lines on a small notepad. He didn't show it to the boy. He simply wrote, "Gray suit, right wristwatch, black face, scar near jaw, hair graying at temples, catering hallway, 36th floor." He looked at the boy again. "Elijah, do you know what I do for a living?" "My mom says you own buildings." "That's part of it. I also own a company that owns other companies, about 19 of them. They make different things. Some make medicine, some make machines, some build houses. And inside all of those companies there are people who like me and people who don't. There are people who'd be glad if I lived a long time, and people who'd be glad if I didn't." He paused. "I'm telling you this because I want you to understand that what you saw this morning probably wasn't random. The man in the hallway didn't choose me by accident. Someone sent him." Elijah's eyes didn't widen the way Richard had expected. They simply became very quiet. "I thought so," the boy said softly. There was a soft sound at the door. 2 knocks, a pause, 1 more knock. Richard crossed the carpet quickly, unlocked the door, and stepped back. Frank Morrison entered without speaking, closed the door behind him, and locked it himself. He was a broad-shouldered man in his late 50s with closely cropped silver hair and a calm that never seemed to waver. Whether he was ordering breakfast or extracting a man from a burning vehicle, he'd done both in the past year. His eyes went first to Richard, then to the mug on the marble table, then to the boy on the sofa. He didn't ask. He simply nodded once at Elijah, the way one soldier might nod to another across a field, then looked at Richard and waited. Richard told him. He told him in 3 minutes what had happened in the past 20. Frank listened without writing anything down. When Richard finished, Frank walked to the marble table, knelt beside it, and studied the mug from 3 different angles without touching it. Then he stood and took a small evidence bag from the inside pocket of his jacket. He always carried 2. Richard had teased him about it once, and Frank had said, "A man who carries evidence bags is a man who's ready to remember things correctly." "I need the cup intact," Frank said quietly. "Sealed and on its way to a lab within the hour. I have a lab. It's not in this building. Results will come back by tonight, maybe sooner. Until then, no one on this floor learns anything happened. No one in this building. Understood, Richard?" "Yes. The boy stays with me." Frank looked at Elijah. He spoke gently, the way he spoke to his own grandchildren. "Son, your mother is downstairs on the 36th floor." "Yes, sir." "What's her name?" "Doreen. Doreen Walker." "Thank you. I'm going to send someone quietly to let her know you're safe and that you're with Mr. Sterling. She won't be told why. Just that you're helping him with something and you'll be back with her this afternoon. Is that all right?" The boy nodded. Frank turned back to Richard. "I'm going to walk the catering hallway myself in about 12 minutes. I want it to look ordinary. I want the cameras pulled before I get there so whoever's watching the feed doesn't see me looking too carefully at the wrong cart. Give me 30 minutes for the first pass, then we'll talk about next steps." "Frank?" "Yes." "Find the man with the scar." Frank met his eyes. "I will." He picked up the mug with a gloved hand, slid it carefully into the evidence bag, sealed it, and walked out the way he'd come. The door clicked softly behind him. Richard stood by the window for a long moment after he was gone. He looked at the river. He looked at the small tugboat that was now almost out of sight around the bend. He thought about the 19 companies. He thought about the 3 board meetings scheduled for this week. He thought about the lawsuit filed against the pharmaceutical division in May, the merger he'd blocked in February, and the partner he'd quietly forced into retirement in December because the man had been moving funds in ways that didn't have a clean explanation. Any one of them, or none of them, or someone he hadn't yet considered. He turned around. Elijah was watching him from the sofa. The small bottle of chocolate milk was now empty, set carefully on the side table with the cap screwed back on, as if the boy had been raised to leave a place exactly as he'd found it. "Elijah," Richard said quietly, "I think you should know something. You didn't just save my life this morning. You did something much harder. You made a decision that most grown men in this building wouldn't have made. You saw something wrong, and you didn't look away. Do you understand how rare that is?" The boy thought about it. "My mom looks at things," he said finally. "She taught me to look at things." Richard sat down slowly in the armchair across from the sofa. For the first time that morning, he wasn't behind a desk, and the boy wasn't on the other side of the room. They were 2 people sitting in a quiet space, with the city laid out behind them. And Richard asked the question he'd been wanting to ask since the boy first stepped through the door. "Tell me about your mother." The boy's face changed in a small way that Richard recognized. It was the way a person's face changes when they're about to talk about someone they love, and they're trying not to make it sound bigger than it is. "Her name is Doreen Walker," Elijah said. "She's worked in this building for almost 5 years. She used to work 2 jobs, but last year she stopped the second one because her back started hurting. Now she just works here. She wakes up at 4 in the morning. She makes my breakfast and packs my lunch before she leaves. She comes home at 6. She makes dinner. She helps me with my homework. She reads with me before bed. On Saturdays we go to the library, and on Sundays we go to church." "Where's your father?" The boy looked down at his hands. "He died when I was 4. He was a bus driver. He had a heart attack while he was driving. He pulled the bus over and parked it and made sure all the passengers were okay before he called for help. The doctor said if he hadn't pulled over, he might have lived. But he didn't want anyone to get hurt." The boy paused. "My mom keeps a picture of him on the wall by the kitchen. She talks to it sometimes." Richard didn't say anything for a moment. He was thinking about the kind of woman who would raise a boy like this on a cleaner's wages, who would teach him to look at things, who would send him into the world with the conviction that doing right was its own reward, even when it cost you. He was thinking that he'd walked past her in the lobby 100 times without knowing her name. "Elijah," he said, "when this is over, your mother and I are going to have a conversation." The boy looked up quickly. There was a flash of something in his face that wasn't quite fear but was close to it. "She didn't do anything wrong, sir." "No, that's not what I mean." Richard leaned forward slightly. "I mean I owe her something. I owe her for raising the kind of boy who walked into my office this morning. I don't yet know what that something is. I'll figure it out, but she's going to know my name the way I now know hers." The boy thought about that. Then he nodded once, and his shoulders settled the small fraction they'd been holding tight. There was a soft buzz from the desk. Richard stood and picked up the phone. It was Frank, and his voice was low and quick. "Richard, I'm in the catering hallway now. There are 2 carts here that match what the boy described. I've located the camera feed from this morning between 7:30 and 8:10. There's a 6-minute gap in the recording. The system says it was a routine refresh. It wasn't. Someone pulled the feed manually and re-uploaded a loop. They were sloppy. The same pigeon flies past the window 3 times in 2 minutes. I have the original somewhere on the backup server and I'm pulling it now." "How long?" 40 minutes for the footage. The lab is faster. I should have a preliminary on the cup within the hour." "Frank, the camera was pulled. That means someone in the building." "Yes, someone with access to the security system." A small silence on the line. "Richard," Frank said quietly, "there are only 11 people in this building who have that level of access. You're one of them. I'm another. That leaves 9. Richard closed his eyes for one long second. "Get me the list," he said, "and get me the footage." He set the phone down and looked across the room at the boy. "Elijah, I need to make one more call. After that, I'm going to have lunch brought up. You're going to eat something hot. Then I'm going to ask you to look at some photographs and tell me if any of the faces are the man you saw." "Yes, sir." Richard picked up the phone again and dialed a number that wasn't in any contact list and wasn't written anywhere searchable. It was a number he'd memorized in 1997 and used perhaps a dozen times since. The line picked up on the second ring. "It's Richard. I need a quiet sweep of my building. I need it done within 4 hours. I'm not calling the authorities yet. I want to know what I'm dealing with before I decide what to do about it. Send people who can come in as maintenance. Send people who won't ask questions of my staff. I want eyes on every floor by 2 o'clock this afternoon." He listened for a moment, then said, "Thank you, Daniel," and hung up. He didn't explain the call to the boy. The boy didn't ask. They sat together in the quiet office and waited. 43 minutes later, Frank came back. He came up the north stairwell again. He knocked the same pattern. Richard let him in and locked the door behind him. Frank walked to the desk, set down a slim laptop and opened it without speaking. Then he turned the screen toward Richard and Elijah and pressed play. The footage was grainy, the way internal security footage always was, but the man was clearly visible. He was standing beside a stainless steel cart in a narrow hallway. He was tall. He was wearing a gray suit. His hair was dark with gray at the temples. He took a small brown bottle from his inside left pocket. He unscrewed the cap. He poured carefully, counting under his breath, into a white ceramic mug. He screwed the cap back on. He wiped the bottle with a napkin. He put the bottle back into his pocket. He picked up the mug and walked out of frame toward the executive elevator. The whole thing took 91 seconds. Richard watched it twice. The second time, he watched the man's face when he turned his head briefly toward something off camera, perhaps a sound, perhaps the freight elevator door opening. The man's face was visible for 2 full seconds. There was a small scar along the right side of his jaw, just below the ear. "That's him," Elijah said quietly from beside the chair. "That's him," Frank said. "His name is Victor Marsh. He's worked in this building for 14 months. He came in through a third-party staffing contract for executive catering. His background check was clean. It was also, I now know, fabricated. The references on his application are real companies. The phone numbers route to a single answering service in Delaware that was set up 6 weeks before he applied. I have the records. They won't hold up to a serious look. They were never meant to." "Who is he really?" "I'm working on that. The face isn't in any database I can access in the next hour. I'll know more tonight. What I do know is that he's not in the building right now. He left through the south service entrance at 8:22 this morning, 8 minutes after the cup was delivered to your office. He hasn't come back. His phone is off. His apartment, the one listed on his employment file, is a short-term rental paid in cash through January." Richard absorbed this slowly. "And the cup?" Frank exhaled. "The lab called 5 minutes ago. Preliminary only. They'll have full results by 6. The cup contained a colorless, nearly tasteless compound. It's not a household poison. It's not something you buy. It's something that's made. In the dose that was in that cup, it would have caused symptoms consistent with a cardiac event within 40 to 90 minutes of ingestion. There would have been no obvious sign of poisoning. The death certificate would have read heart attack. You're 63. You have a known family history of cardiac issues. No one would have asked." Richard sat very still. "No one would have asked," he repeated quietly. Frank closed the laptop. He didn't sit down. He stood with one hand resting on the edge of the desk and waited, the way he always waited when he'd given Richard information that required a decision rather than a reaction. "Richard," he said, "the list of 11. I have it. 9 names besides yours and mine. I think you already know which one we need to look at first." "Show me." Frank slid a single folded sheet of paper across the desk. Richard opened it. He read the 9 names slowly. He'd hired 7 of them himself over the course of the past 22 years. The other 2 he'd inherited when he'd acquired the building in 2013. He knew their wives. He knew their children's schools. He'd attended 3 of their weddings. He'd spoken at the funeral of one of their fathers. He read the list 3 times. Then his eyes settled on the 5th name. "Gregory Ashton," he said quietly. Frank nodded. "I thought so too." Gregory Ashton was the chief financial officer of Sterling Capital. He'd held the position for 10 years. He had access to every system in the building. He'd been with Richard in Tokyo on Monday night and had flown back on the same plane at 6 that morning. He'd been the one to suggest, in a quiet conversation in December, that perhaps the partner who'd been moving funds in unexplained ways shouldn't be forced into retirement, but should instead be allowed to retire with dignity. Richard hadn't listened. He'd pushed the man out anyway. Gregory hadn't raised the issue again. But it had been Gregory, 4 months ago, who'd brought Victor Marsh's catering contract to Richard's attention with a small approving note attached. "Reliable provider. Background clean. Recommend." Richard hadn't even read the file. He'd signed the cover sheet and moved on to the next item in the stack. "Frank," he said quietly, "I want to be careful here. The fact that Gregory recommended the contract isn't proof. He recommends a dozen contracts a quarter. I don't want to destroy a man's life because of a coincidence." "Agreed. But I want to know where he is right now." "Find out." Frank picked up his phone and stepped to the far corner of the office. He spoke quietly for 2 minutes, listened, spoke again, then ended the call and walked back. He's in his office on the 38th floor, Frank said. He's been there since 7 this morning. He took one phone call at 8:13, 1 minute before your coffee was delivered. The call lasted 41 seconds. It came from a number that's not in our internal directory. I'm pulling the routing now. Richard looked down at the list again. Then he folded it carefully and put it in his inside jacket pocket. Frank, I want 2 things. First, a full reconstruction of Gregory's movements for the past 6 months. Every meeting, every flight, every dinner the company paid for, every dinner he expensed personally. Second, I want the partner I forced out in December. I want to know where he's been living, who he's been talking to, and whether his name has ever appeared in any document that also contains Victor Marsh's name. The man's name was Carter Reeves. You remember him? I remember him. Go quietly. Use Hannah's people if you need them. I will. Frank left. The door closed behind him. The office was quiet again. Richard turned toward the sofa. Elijah hadn't moved during the entire conversation. He'd sat with his hands folded and his eyes lowered, the way a child who'd been raised in church sits during a long sermon, present but careful not to interrupt. Now he looked up. Sir, he said quietly, are you going to call my mom soon? I told her I'd be back by lunchtime. Richard looked at him for a long moment. Then, for the first time since the morning had begun, he smiled. It was a small smile, tired around the edges, but real. Yes, Elijah, he said. We're going to call your mother right now. Richard picked up the desk phone and pressed the line for the 36th floor reception. He asked, in the calm and ordinary voice he used for ordinary requests, whether they could send Doreen Walker up to the chairman's office. He said it was nothing to be concerned about. He said her son was helping him with a small project and he wanted to thank her in person. He said it the way a man says small things when he wants the staff on the line to repeat the message to their colleagues exactly as he'd said it, without coloring or alarm. Doreen Walker arrived 7 minutes later. She came up alone in the elevator. Richard opened the door for her himself. She was a small woman in her late 30s, her hair pulled back in a practical knot, her posture upright from years of carrying things for a living. She wore the gray uniform of the building's cleaning crew. Her name tag was slightly crooked. She saw Elijah on the sofa first, and her shoulders dropped about half an inch, and Richard understood that she'd been holding her breath since she'd been told to come upstairs. Mrs. Walker, Richard said quietly, please come in. Your son is safe. He's not in any trouble. I'm going to explain what happened this morning, but before I do, I want you to sit down, and I want you to know that the only reason I'm alive at this moment is because of him. She looked at him for a long second. Then she walked to the sofa, sat down beside her son, and put her arm around him without saying anything. Elijah leaned into her side the small fraction that 10-year-old boys allow themselves to lean. Richard told her. He told her in plain language, leaving nothing out except the names of the suspects. He told her about the coffee. He told her about the catering hallway. He told her about Frank and the lab and the footage. He told her about the moment her son had walked into his office and what her son had said. She listened without speaking. Her hand stayed on her son's shoulder. When Richard finished, she sat for a long moment looking at the carpet between her feet. Then she lifted her head and looked at Richard. Mr. Sterling, she said quietly, I've raised that boy by myself for 6 years. I've done it on what this building pays me. I've done it because his father taught me before he died that you don't measure a life by how much you have, but by what you leave behind in the people you love. I'm not surprised that my son came up here this morning. I'm not surprised that he saw what he saw and did what he did. I'm surprised only that the world finally let him be seen for it. Richard nodded slowly. He didn't trust his voice for a moment. Mrs. Walker, he said when he could, there's no version of this that ends with the two of you returning to your apartment tonight and tomorrow continuing as if nothing happened. The men who tried to do this to me will know by tonight that they failed. They'll be looking for the reason they failed. They'll look at the cameras. They'll see your son in the catering hallway. They'll see him going up the stairs. I can't leave the two of you in a place where they can find you." She didn't flinch. "What are you proposing?" "I have a property in the country, 3 hours from here. It's staffed and secure. There's a small school within 10 minutes that I've supported quietly for many years. I'd like the two of you to go there tonight. My driver, Anthony, will take you. You'll be guests, not employees. You'll stay as long as necessary. When this is over, we'll talk about what comes after." Doreen looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Elijah. Then she nodded once. "Thank you," she said simply. That was all. That was enough. By 4 that afternoon, Frank had what he needed. He came up the north stairwell for the 3rd time that day, knocked the pattern, and laid 2 folders on Richard's desk. The first folder contained a printout of phone records. The second contained a single photograph and a short typed summary. The call to Gregory's office at 8:13 this morning came from a prepaid phone purchased at a convenience store in Wilmington 6 weeks ago, Frank said. That same prepaid phone made 2 other calls in the past month. Both were to Carter Reeves. Both lasted longer than 30 minutes. Richard looked down at the records. He didn't speak. "Victor Marsh," Frank continued, "isn't Victor Marsh. His real name is Victor Marston. He spent 11 years in private security in 3 different countries. He left the last position under circumstances that weren't made public, but that were serious enough to end his career on that continent. He came back to the United States 2 years ago. He's been available for hire, quietly, for the right price. He's been associated with 2 suspicious deaths that were never formally investigated. He is, in plain language, the kind of man you bring in when you want a problem to look like an accident." "And Gregory?" Frank exhaled slowly. "Gregory has been making payments to a holding company that ultimately routes to Carter Reeves for the past 7 months. The payments are disguised inside legitimate vendor invoices in the medical division. The total so far is just over $2 million. He started the payments 6 weeks after Carter was forced out. I have the bank trail. It's clean enough to take to a prosecutor." Richard looked at the second folder. He opened it. The photograph inside showed Gregory Ashton, his chief financial officer of 10 years, the man who'd stood beside him at the funeral of Richard's wife in 2018, sitting at a corner table in a small restaurant in Wilmington with Carter Reeves and Victor Marston. The photograph was dated 3 weeks ago. All 3 men were laughing. Richard closed the folder. "Frank," he said quietly, "call Detective Sandoval. I'm ready now." What happened over the next 48 hours moved with the kind of speed that money and preparation can buy when both are pointed in the same direction. Gregory Ashton was arrested in his own office on the 38th floor at 6:15 that evening. He didn't resist. He looked, when the officers came through his door, like a man who'd been waiting for it for a long time. Carter Reeves was picked up at a hotel in Wilmington an hour later. Victor Marston was found in a rental car at the Canadian border the following morning. The prepaid phone was still in his glove compartment. The charges were read on the steps of the courthouse 3 days later: conspiracy to commit murder, attempted murder, hiring an assassin, wire fraud, embezzlement, identity fraud. The lab results from the cup of coffee were entered into evidence. The security footage was entered into evidence. The testimony of a 10-year-old boy named Elijah Walker, who'd climbed 9 flights of stairs to tell a stranger that something didn't look right, became the cornerstone of the prosecution. Richard didn't attend most of the proceedings. He'd been there once, at the arraignment, and that had been enough. He'd seen Gregory's face across the courtroom, and Gregory hadn't looked at him. And Richard had understood that whatever conversation he might have wanted to have with the man he'd trusted for 10 years was a conversation that would never happen now. Some doors close in a single morning and can't be opened again. In the weeks that followed, Richard's life rearranged itself in the small and large ways that lives do after they've been almost ended and given back. He restructured the executive leadership of Sterling Capital. He hired an independent firm to audit every contract Gregory had ever approved. He made changes to the security protocols of the building that he should have made years earlier. He stopped drinking coffee he hadn't seen poured. He started taking the stairs in the mornings, all 45 flights of them, 3 days a week. He thought about Elijah Walker every one of those mornings. Doreen Walker and her son stayed at the country property for almost 6 weeks. By the end of the second week, Doreen had stopped sleeping with the lamp on. By the end of the fourth week, Elijah had finished 2 books from the library Richard hadn't even known he owned, and had started a third. They walked in the mornings along the small pond behind the house. They ate dinner at a long oak table in a kitchen that hadn't seen regular use in more than a decade. The housekeeper, a quiet older woman named Catherine who'd worked for Richard since before his wife had died, told him on the phone one evening that the place hadn't felt like a home in a very long time, and that it felt like one again. Richard drove out to see them every Sunday. On the 6th Sunday, he sat with Doreen on the small porch overlooking the pond, while Elijah practiced casting a fishing line he'd received as a gift from Anthony 2 weeks earlier. The afternoon was warm. The water was still. Richard had brought a folder with him. He set it on the small table between their chairs and didn't open it for a long time. "Mrs. Walker," he said eventually, "I've been thinking about what I owe you. I've been thinking about it for 6 weeks. I don't believe I can pay it. I don't believe there's a number that would be the correct number. But there are some things I can do, and I'd like your permission to do them." She looked at him. She didn't pick up the folder. She waited. "I'd like to pay for Elijah's education from this point until he no longer wants to be in school. Whatever school he chooses, whatever subject he chooses. I'd like to establish a trust in his name that doesn't depend on me being alive to administer it. I'd like to offer you a position in my company in any role that interests you, at any salary you name, with the understanding that you can also choose not to take the position and instead simply allow me to make sure that the 2 of you never again wake up in the morning worrying about whether the rent will be paid on time." She was quiet for a long moment. She looked out at her son by the pond. "Mr. Sterling," she said finally, "I don't need your money. I've never needed anyone's money. I've needed only enough to keep my son fed and warm and in school, and I've always managed that. So I'm not going to take the position, and I'm not going to take the salary." She paused. "But I will let you pay for his school, because that's for him and not for me. And I'll accept the trust, because his father would have wanted him to have something his father couldn't provide. And I'll accept your Sunday visits for as long as you want to bring them." Richard didn't speak for a moment. "Thank you," he said quietly. "Thank you," she said back. They sat in silence and watched Elijah cast his line out over the pond. He wasn't catching anything. He didn't seem to mind. There are stories we tell ourselves about how the world works, about who matters and who doesn't, about which lives are visible and which are not. Most of those stories are wrong. Most of the time, the people who save us aren't the people we expect. Most of the time, the warnings come from voices we've been trained not to hear, in hallways we don't walk, from children whose names we've never bothered to learn. Elijah Walker climbed 9 flights of stairs on a Thursday morning to tell a man he didn't know that something wasn't right. He did it because his mother had taught him to look at things. He did it because his father, in the last minutes of his own life, had pulled a bus over to protect strangers. He did it because doing the right thing was, in his family, the simplest and the hardest thing in the world. Pay attention to the small voices. Learn the names of the people who clean your buildings, drive your cars, hand you your coffee in the morning. Never assume that the most important person in your life today is the person whose name is already on your calendar. Sometimes the bravest voice in the room is the smallest one. And sometimes, all it takes to change the entire course of a life is 4 words, spoken quietly by a child who refused to look away. The warnings we need most often come from voices we've been taught to ignore. If this story moved you, please tap the like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to The Inner Blade so the next story finds you too. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and remember, always listen to the small voices in your life. You never know which one might save you.